Think beyond traditional business banking. Think a partner that gives you in-depth financial insights.
If you have just tuned in, welcome to the Power Table, where we dissect the biggest themes that are driving African businesses and markets. The agenda on this week's table is whether state-owned enterprises should be privatized or not. SOEs play a critical role in Africa's economy. They provide infrastructure and services such as electricity, water, freight logistics, transport, and telecommunications. The argument that usually follows is that these entities are entities of national importance and are able to provide these services to the public at a lower cost than otherwise would be the case if they were managed by private hands. But years of mismanagement and corruption, wasteful expenditure have led to many SOEs registering serial losses and becoming increasingly reliant on bailouts from government, which are often funded through higher taxes. And this has also led to increased arguments that many SOEs would be better run in private hands. To debate this further, I am joined by Advocate Fay Mukaddam. She's the Chartered Director for South Africa and Governance Specialist at the Institute of Directors in South Africa. Menzi Ndhlovu, the Senior Analyst at Signal Risk, as well as Peter Attard, Montalto, the Managing Director over at Intellidex. To all of you, thanks so much for your time. Fay, I'd like to start off with you because we're ultimately trying to answer the question to privatize or not to privatize SOEs. What would your answer to that question be?
Thanks, Fifi. Thanks for having me and to your viewers. I think that the question might be rather premature in that, all of this activity has come on the back of the draft bill that's looking at the South Africa Incorporated Holdco, which I think is now the State Asset Management Company. So we're going to call it SAM just for ease. But the idea that you have a centralized shareholder model that brings all the better performing SOEs under one umbrella, and then looking at how you introduce some efficiencies, how you strengthen accountability, is in principle a good idea. However, certainly the draft bill doesn't answer many of the questions that we have, and it doesn't go far enough in terms of providing any kind of assurance that we won't just be creating a mammoth a singular entity which might then fail multidimensionally, as we've seen other failures in the economy in vertical streams. So I don't think that privatization is really the crux of the matter, because I think that in order for us to be sustainable and strengthen our economy and make sure that it's more elastic, and have a robust business environment, you need to consider that business has to participate, and potentially in terms of the subsidiaries that will fall under the State Asset Management Company, you definitely do need to consider private sector or minority shareholding, because that also counterweights a government being the sole shareholder. And I don't think that government has sufficiently proved to us that it can actually run entities according to commercially viable principles, as well as taking the developmental context into account.
Fay, if I just stick with you, to respond to the intervention you made around this proposed bill in South Africa's case, leaving you with many unanswered questions. If you could just give us a sense of what a few of those may be.
Sure. I mean, Fifi, it doesn't go far enough. There's certain things. So language in law, there's if this company doesn't deliver consistent and persistent, they say, objectives and meeting its targets, then, government has the right to maybe call a special general meeting. That's a bit of weak language for me. I think the idea that the SOEs that are going to be included in the first phase, which are already corporatized, they are, Safcol is a fantastic example. I mean, they're the only ones that have been paying dividends in the last 5 to 6 years, so that's great. The others are fine. But the big ticket items like Eskom and Transnet, the intention is, I suppose, to bring them into phase 2. And there isn't sufficient clarity in the draft bill around the accountability frameworks and how the multiple accountability frameworks from a governance perspective, which currently exist, are going to be remedied. Because the question then is, if we could have fixed our state-owned entities already, why haven't we? If we could have introduced not privatization, but public-private partnerships to run or oversee these state-owned entities according to different principles, why haven't we? So whilst this idea of a singular centralized shareholder model entity has been mooted, I think, from 2005 already. So we saw it coming. It's just that suddenly everybody's excited about it because of the bill, but it doesn't answer the questions around one of the key items of the separation of power and segregation of duties.
Sure.
We've currently had legislation in place that's largely been ignored in the PFMA. The shareholder, and we've seen with what's happening at Eskom with the proposed appointment of the CEO, that the shareholder still has control, which then undermines the board's independence and the board's power. So I don't see any of that being responded to or remedied in the bill.
Okay. Peter, to bring you in here and to also go back to the original question around the privatization of SOEs, whether some SOEs can still function as they have been functioning from their genesis in their current shape or form right now, or whether they are due a correction and a restructure, as it seems South Africa's model is trying to pursue with this proposed SOE amendment bill being dubbed one of the biggest restructurings of public entities that we have seen thus far.
Good afternoon. So I think the problem of the question is we actually just don't know what government policy on SOEs actually is. There is all this talk in various parliamentary appearances of ministers, in various speeches, but there is no singular policy. There is no green paper actually telling us what the point of them are, what the bill is meant to do, how they're meant to be governed, how they're meant to interact with the private sector, how you're meant to deal with this issue of if there are implicit subsidies that come into the way that the SOEs work. The last time that there was a policy green paper was 2000. It was 23 years ago. It was from Jeff Radebe. He actually had hair then. I just found the document. And, you know, it's just a lifetime ago that the last time the government put anything out. And I think it's very hard to answer the privatization question without that broader context. Ultimately, you know, an SOE should be placed wherever it can best serve fundamentally its function, and often, given limited capacity in the state sector, that will, in some occasions, be with greater degrees of private involvement. But equally, there isn't the framework to do that. We've seen the nightmare that private creditors and private shareholders have had in the airports company. In particular, we're seeing the drama going on at SAA still around minority shareholders. So I think it's very easy to talk about the sort of theoretical aspects of this, but mapping the pathway from here to there is exceptionally challenging without any of these sort of fundamental building blocks.
So in terms of trying to configure what a modern map looks like right now, perhaps let's draw from the idea that the Public Enterprises Minister of South Africa has in his mind around this centralized model for SOEs, all of them being bundled under this holding company, the aim being to better manage them, and the aim also to being to reduce the interference of the shareholder, as it were. And I say that in quote. In terms of that map configuration, what's your view on the proposed bill, Peter? Fay told us that good in principle, very questionable in practice. What would your response be?
Well, the bill doesn't tell us actually what this holdco is meant to do. It says it's meant to exercise the shareholder functions, but it doesn't talk about good governance. It doesn't talk about financial sustainability. It mentions that the shareholder basically through the holdco will give instructions once a year to SOEs. Now, it doesn't say, is that a developmental agenda? Is it around, you know, how the thing operates? Is it around, you know, productivity or whatever, or developmental mandates? So actually, we just don't know. And I think that's what the bill needs to say. And it's what the bill needs to fit into as well in terms of wider context with a green paper. The bill leaves a lot open to secondary legislation or regulation, and a minister or the president can basically gazette anything they like in terms of the bill, in terms of then how it operates after it comes in. But no, I mean, I think we need to really go back to first principles here. This thing is very badly drafted, and I think is not really fit for purpose.
Menzi, you have your eye on the continent. You're looking at what quite a number of countries have done in the recent while. Angola comes to mind right now in terms of what it's trying to do with its publicly run companies. It has sold strategic interests in a few of them as a part of perhaps increasing the level of private sector participation, relieving the government also of some fiscal pressures in funding a lot of the services that some of the SOEs used to do. Ethiopia on a similar drive, if we see how that market has opened up, for instance, its telecommunications industry, the same can be made for Egypt. So just looking at what is happening across the continent and, of course, reflecting on the South Africa's interventions as well, what would your response be right now as to whether SOEs should be privatized or whether they should be left to be?
Yeah, I think the previous two speakers spoke to the fundamental point or the fundamental contention around SOEs in South Africa and in the continent at large. And I think in South Africa, what we can extrapolate is that we have a problem of leadership. All right. If you look back to the trajectory of our SOEs over the last 20 odd years, these were fairly well-renowned, well-run institutions. And with the lapse in governance in the mid-2000s, that had a knock-on effect on the governance and the professionalism of our SOEs in South Africa. And I think before we can talk about conversations or have conversations of privatization, we should look at the fundamental problem. And then, can we privatize in the current context or the context of our political leadership? And I think it would be a hard sell, all right, unless we reform the quality of our leadership, unless we reform our ethos, it'll be a hard sell, all right. And to relate that to the context around the continent, all right, where we see functioning parastatals, we see relatively good political leadership. You know what I'm saying? They might have shortcomings in other aspects, all right, but when it comes to the running of state institutions, they are pretty prudent. You see that with Ethiopia and Ethiopian Airlines. You see that with Ethio Telecom. You also see stories of remarkable turnarounds, as you mentioned, in Angola with Sonangol and Sodiama. All of this, or Ndiama rather, all of this stems from political will, all right, a proper directional shift among the entities that SOEs report to, which then translates to a clear mandate, all right, a governance shift within SOEs, and then an attempt to also to reform or professionalize the SOEs themselves. And I think this is something that we can learn from in South Africa as we seek to reform our SOEs. And then there's also a conversation about regulation or deregulation that needs to be had. And it's interesting, in Ethiopia, you have the conversation on privatization and deregulation. And I think this is something that's been missing in the South African discourse, right? This scope for greater private engagement in certain sectors. For instance, I don't think there is a very persuasive reason for Eskom to have its monopoly on the broad electricity supply chain, all right? And I think there's scope for greater private engagement there. So in and amongst the conversation on privatization, we ought to have the conversation on deregulation as well as we look to optimize our economy.
One can argue that in the case of Eskom, maybe that is starting to happen. I mean, we have seen the announcements, and not even the announcements, actions of the division of the bigger beast, as it were, into three separate entities, transmission, distribution and generation. Of course, there's a whole lot of things that still need to be done to make sure that that's a functioning case. But Menzi, I'd just like to ask, in the event that perhaps in an ideal situation where now you are able to get good governance and good leadership amongst these parastatals, and maybe we stick to South Africa as an example, would you go about transforming the parastatal landscape with the model that South Africa is proposing, whereby you've got this central shareholder form, everything being bundled under one holding company, government being the major, or the president or whichever respective cabinet being the major shareholder and all that, but being managed by an independent board? Would you go about it in that way, or perhaps can South Africa learn something from its peers on the continent, Angola, Egypt, Ethiopia, who are doing it a different way by inviting the private sector to partake of a strategic interest rather than a broader holding company?
I think I lean towards the latter, purely because of our experience and the experience of other countries on the continent with respect to having the government as a decisive figure within the SOE. And the concern there is mandate creep and the risk that SOEs are still co-opted into the broader political machinery and therefore having their operational and other aspects being undermined. So I would say that I'm not entirely in favor of the current mechanism that's being proposed, and I'd lean towards an Ethiopian model or an Angolan model where we do invite private shareholders to have a strategic say in SOEs. So yeah, leave it there.
Okay, Fay, one could argue also, again, Eskom as well as Transnet recently getting a partner over in the Philippines to partner with them on one of their ports here in the country. So that model of inviting the private sector happening at respective parastatals, perhaps not all. In fact, there's around 700, so maybe it would be difficult to keep up with everything that's going on. But in terms of your view as to what would be the best way to transform SOEs for better purpose, you have spoken against your concerns around the centralized shareholder model South Africa is pursuing, but what do you think about what our peers are doing elsewhere?
So the OECD and the World Bank Group has done quite a lot of work around this. And to Menzi's point, I think that we have a lot of expertise and experience to draw on elsewhere in the world where this has succeeded and where it has failed. We can also just consider, Fifi, there are other models to look at, and I haven't seen any evidence that these have been considered and weighed up. So immediately we've erred to the centralized shareholder model. There's twin track models, there's dual economy models, etc. Not that I'm suggesting those would be appropriate for now. However, I don't think that the two are mutually exclusive. I don't believe that the principle isn't sound. I think the idea that is driving this state asset management company is solid. However, it contains the rhetoric that we've already heard in terms of depoliticization, introducing or streamlining governance efficiencies, introducing operational and budgetary robustness, etc. Now, we've heard that before, and we have seen how, even with the Public Finance Management Act in place, which is founded on some of those principles, where law should not be transgressed, we've seen how current leadership in current SOEs have transgressed law. And so when there's no transparency, when there's no active consequence management, that is what begs the question of how will this new holdco be any different, except what you're doing is putting everything into one pot, and that potentially means the failure on a multidimensional mammoth perspective. Now, I would rather consider, and I'm not just excluding it, but I would rather we consider looking at state-owned entities. Let's look at how in the subsidiaries, if we don't have a sole shareholder in holdco, but we look at introducing or inviting in private entities and private partners in the subsidiaries, because there's different experience and expertise in the verticals. So if you look at whether it's Telkom, if you look at Safcol, if you look at Centec, you can invite different entities, and what that does does is it acts as a counterweight in terms of the balance that we need with government. Now, my concern again is when we've played out in the Eskom arena, the very fact that a CEO is not appointed by the board and reporting into the board, and that the shareholder, who is espoused in the minister, then can override the board, undermine the board. It starts introducing that vagueness and blurred lines around accountability, responsibility, and then who do you hold accountable, and where's the consequence management? We had this with SAA long ago when we had a foreign CEO whom we gave a very expensive gold handshake to, which I think our economy is still paying for. So for me, the board not being independent, the board not having complete power and authority over operational, providing strategic governance, and then giving the CEO the full operational mandate and authority, I think that's then just going to be a repeat of the same. And whether it's through the bill or the thinking in terms of the National Planning Commission or the Presidential Review Committee previously, that detail is missing. And I think Peter very eloquently in a recent article put that the bill must not be drafted for Mandela, but for Zuma. So I also think when we're talking about sustainability, let's look at what is elastic. And this idea that it is only private sector that can be running businesses in a commercially feasible and viable manner, I think is flawed, because we've seen many commercial collapses. And I think the idea that government can't is also flawed. Sure. So if we have all the ingredients, it's just about having political will, leadership impetus to make it so, Fifi.
Sure. And I think that's what has been showed, because Fay, I'm glad that you mentioned Telkom, because you get a sense that what this government is trying to do, the South African government, is to produce another Telkom or a whole lot more Telcoms where you've got a successful turnaround story to share with the country and with the world. So Peter, if I just get your final thoughts here on, how can this government achieve what was done with Telkom across the SOE spectrum, and is it possible in your view?
Well, the success of Telkom, and let's not overplay Telkom, Telkom has gone through a very rocky road, right? But has had seriously positive spurts, obviously, of productivity, of innovation that have happened since it was moved out from being a sole SOE. Is ultimately it paid people the right amount of money to attract talent. And this is still the unanswered question, I think, around the holdco. Everyone waves at Asian models. The CEO of Temasek earns $30 million a year. A mid-ranking manager earns easily $2 million a year. This is the type of money the holdco would have to pay to attract serious talent to manage SOEs collectively. And it's the same if you want to run a globally competitive airline. You're going to have to pay a serious amount more than currently would be on the table for SAA. But I think this comes back to the issue which Fay raised earlier. You need this mix of talent, regardless of if it's privatized or not. You need a mix of talent, and you have to pay for it, and that contributes into governance as well. It's as much about internal governance as upwards into a shareholder. We need better boards. The new board of Transnet has some better names on it, but it's still, I would say it barely reaches a low bar. It's certainly not the bar we need to see for highly complex entities like Transnet, and it's the same for management as well. And we're obviously having a lot of discussions now about Transnet's management. Now, I think you can, or you're more likely to be able to attract that sort of input with private sector shareholdings. But the bill only states majority. The government has to maintain a majority shareholding, whereas they are selling or trying to sell a 51% stake in SAA. So again, there's a lot of confusion about what this really means. I think, again, we come back to these fundamental building blocks. If you are going to go down the privatization route, you need minority shareholder rights. You need independence and degree of self-sufficiency from the state and from ministers to prevent fiddling. And from there, hopefully, regardless of exactly how things are structured, things can get a bit better. But that's exactly why we need a green paper to lay all this out.
We are unfortunately out of time, Peter, but I think perhaps a follow-up conversation on that green paper, as you say, last updated in 2000, so 23 years ago. A follow-up conversation on if we had to have a modern green paper right now governing SOEs, what would it look like, and how could it provide the more solid foundation, as it were, to look towards their transformation for the betterment of society. But to all of you, thanks so much for your time and your insights and interventions in this. Advocate Fay Mukaddam, she's the Chartered Director for South Africa and Governance Specialist over at the Institute of Directors here in South Africa. Menzi Ndhlovu, Senior Analyst at Signal Risk, as well as Peter Attard, Montalto, Managing Director over at Intellidex, helping us wrap up the power table for today. Perhaps not all questions answered, but the transformation and restructuring of parastatals on the continent still something that is unfolding. So definitely an opportunity to pick up on those developments.
Think beyond traditional business banking. Think a partner that gives you in-depth financial insights.